We need to ensure that we're in step with consumer expectations, and it's vitally important for our industry. The IAB regularly invests in consumer research to understand consumer concerns and expectations in terms of data usage, as well as understanding thoughts around value exchange. Last week, we ran our most recent field research with a sample of 1,000 Australians aged 18 plus. I'm going to really quickly highlight a few of the findings here this morning and some data points to keep in mind as we discuss both policy and commercial issues this morning. Unsurprisingly, nearly all Australians think that privacy of their personal information and data is at least somewhat important when choosing a digital content or service provider. Concerns about how companies use data has increased significantly over the last 6 months, with 83% indicating that they have an increased concern. Data breaches and data sharing are the leading concerns. People are very focused on the events of the last 6 months in relation to personal and at sometimes sensitive information, which has been dominated by large-scale data breaches by cyber criminals. However, consumers have a significant level of expectation that companies collect data for various useful purposes, so traffic measurement, analytics, and personalising advertising. We often discuss how the industry hasn't done a great job in relation to helping people understand the value exchange of ad-supported areas for content and services. But 77% of Australians do say they are willing to share personal information with online content providers to be able to continue to access content for free or at low cost. Obviously, there's nuance there, terms of relationships, types of sites, etc. But there is that openness to share if there's a transparent and responsible exchange there. In mid-February, the Privacy Act review report was released by the Attorney General's Department with just 116 recommendations for updating our privacy regulatory framework. To help guide us through pros, cons, concerns, considerations, we have a panel of industry experts with a range of views in relation to privacy reform. Our experts on this panel will not only help crystallise possible impacts on the industry, but also encourage people to think ahead in relation to business models, partnerships, and engagement with consumers and audiences. If I could invite the panellists up on stage. Take the final 4 seats that Mike should be on. Welcome. So I'll just quickly introduce the panel, then we're going to have Sarah, who's lived these privacy recommendations for the last 2 months, to give us a bit of a rundown. But we have first Dan Stinton, who's the Managing Director of Guardian Australia and New Zealand. Next to him is Sarah Wallerden, who's our Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs. And then we have Fred, and I'm going to get it wrong, Finiguera, is that right? Awesome. Senior Legal Counsel and Privacy Officer for Seven West Media. And Brett Farrell, who's founder of Westbright XYZ, you say Z or Z? Z? Good. Media and Digital Consultancy, and also Senior Legal Counsel at OFX. Sarah, I have seen your delight, pain, work over the last couple of months. It feels like much longer than since mid-February. Do you want to just give a quick overview on the key issues that we've identified with the government proposals and the key things that the digital advertising industry should be concerned about and why? And I'm happy to be your clicker.
Thanks, Gay. So, as you said, 116 proposals for reform that, if implemented...
Is that working, the mic? No.
No? Oh, yeah, there we go. So, as Gay said, 116 proposals for reform that, if implemented, would essentially significantly overhaul the Privacy Act, including by increasing the scope of data regulated and, if we understand the proposals correctly, pretty severely restrict how advertising can be delivered to consumers. So perhaps starting on a positive, IAB agrees that privacy law needs reform and there are some important aspects of the report that we are very supportive of. So, for example, the report proposes a definition of personal information that requires information or data to be directly linked to a reasonably identifiable individual, which we think is really important. Also, the proposed move away from a consent-centric approach to privacy, which is essential really in circumstances where people are moving more of their lives online and consent fatigue is on the rise. And thirdly, also, we support the proposed definition of de-identification to make clear that it's a process and that data can be functionally de-identified with strict organisational and technical controls to prevent re-identification. So some great things in this report, but also some concerns. And if we could, yeah, thanks, Gay. The first issue that we think is probably the biggest issue for the industry, and I know some may have different views on exactly what the intention is here, and we do need to clarify that with government. But on our reading, the proposal essentially is that consumers should be able to opt out of any segmentation, regardless of the size and regardless of whether the segmentation is based on personal information, de-identified information, or even anonymised information. So we see that as problematic. Firstly, the definition is much too broad. And secondly, the proposed unqualified right to opt out is problematic on a number of levels. So, for example, from an operational perspective, if you can't place someone in a segment for New South Wales, for example, and you can't distinguish them from people in other states, they could potentially receive ads for offers that aren't available to them, contrary to consumer law. So operationally, it is a problem. Commercially, it's problematic as well. So if you're a local food delivery business in Sydney, you can't place, and if you can't place someone in a segment so that your ads go to people outside of your local area, then that's hugely inefficient for advertisers who will massively, will need to sort of pay a lot more or allocate a lot more to their marketing budgets. Also, from a policy and regulatory perspective, there's an issue. The definition proposes to include exclusion targeting. So if people can opt out of exclusion targeting, that's also a huge issue, because exclusion targeting is currently a key way that organisations implement their online safety policies. So it's basically how organisations stop inappropriate content being served to children. So allowing people to opt out of that would hugely undermine those policies and potentially legal requirements as well. So the last point I'd mention on targeting as well is that if our reading is correct, it's actually quite a lot broader than how the EU, for example, approaches targeting. So under the EU Privacy Directive, it's focused on tracking technologies, so things like cookies, digital fingerprinting and advertising identifiers, rather than segmentation of audiences more broadly. So that's our number one issue. Maybe moving to the second issue. Thanks, Gay. The second issue we think is problematic is the proposals around trading. So that, again, the definition of trading is quite broad. It includes any form of sharing of personal information or potentially, depending on how you read the definition, even verification of data points with partner organisations or group members. So that's a bit unclear. And so any of those activities will require consent. Now, some organisations may already be obtaining consent in these circumstances, but it is an area where the proposals go further than pretty much all of the other jurisdictions that the report looks at, like the EU, the UK, and California. In the EU, there are no specific requirements for consent. And in the UK, they've actually recently moved to specifically recognise that intra-group transmission of personal data is an activity that could be considered a legitimate interest and therefore shouldn't require consent. And in California, similarly, sharing of personal information with advertisers and for third-party analytics is permitted if you have a contract in place with that third party. So again, it's an area where we go further than other jurisdictions. And in the context where we're introducing a fair and reasonable requirement, where the whole purpose is to actually move away from a consent-centric approach, it's a bit inconsistent with the general approach of the report. The third issue that I just wanted to mention, the proposal to have a fair and reasonable requirement and the lack of a legitimate interests provision. So the proposal essentially is that every collection, use and disclosure of personal information will need to be both fair and reasonable. And while we support the move away from a consent-centric approach, which is a key reason for introducing this requirement, and of course we want to be, as an industry, it's important that we are fair and reasonable with consumer information. But we also want to make sure that the government agrees with us that everyday data processing activities like segmentation, for example, are in fact fair and reasonable, and that's not going to fall foul of the legal requirements. And given the approach to the proposed definition of targeting, we're really not sure that is very clear. How other jurisdictions have handled this is by introducing a legitimate interests provision or exception to essentially allow collection or use of data for the legitimate interests of the organisation where that outweighs the adverse impact on the individual. And each of the jurisdictions that the government relies on to introduce a fair and reasonable requirement also have some form of a legitimate interests exception, including Canada, the EU, the UK and Singapore. So that's something that we think is missing from the government's report. So essentially some kind of indication of how activities like data processing, analytics, research and other operational activities that are low risk and within consumers' expectations would fit within this fair and reasonable requirement. And finally, just on the last slide, sorry, I think we've
this one?
that was the legitimate interests.
Okay, let's go.
Thanks. Finally, we did talk about a few other issues in our submission as well. It's one to note from that list is whether the report is proposing opt-in consent. I think it's a bit unclear if that's what it's proposing. That could be a real concern for our industry. And just to note a couple of the other things quickly, we've also proposed that if a civil right of action is introduced, that it should have a seriousness threshold. We don't think that, in principle, we're fine with it, but we don't think it's the best way of achieving the government's goals. And on right of erasure, we think that there needs to be appropriate exemptions in place. So they're probably the main things from the submission.
Just a few things. Awesome. All right. We'll spend the rest of the time bringing those to life and pulling apart any different opinions there. So, Dan, I know publishers have a broad range of concerns as well as applause for this report, for you personally. I guess, how do you view the proposal on advertising in particular, and what are your main concerns or praise?
Okay, where do I start? So in summary, I mean, it's probably going to be a bit repetitive to what Sarah's just said, actually. But I'd just say from the outset, yeah, look, The Guardian is very much in favour of the reform overall. It's the Privacy Act 1988. The clue is in the name. I mean, it's obviously had a couple of updates since then, but, Australia's privacy regime, just to state the obvious, has not kept pace with the rest of the world, GDPR, CPRA, Canada, you name it. And we're a real laggard on this, so Australia has to catch up. So just as a first point, I'd make the point that The Guardian, I think us as an industry, should be pretty supportive of us catching up to the rest of the world on this stuff. We have two main concerns, one of which is not relevant necessarily to this audience, but it's important, so I did just want to touch on it. The Guardian is part of Australia's Right to Know Coalition. Sarah touched on this a little bit as well, but a couple of things that are in the report would make it very difficult for us to carry out public interest journalism. So, for example, the statutory tort, the direct course of action, would give the ability for largely wealthy individuals to run interference on us carrying out journalism. You have to invade people's privacy often in order to carry out public interest journalism. And we've seen this play out in a really negative way in the UK, where there is a tort where, to give you just one example of many, a member of parliament in the UK was charged with a serious crime, and we were not able to report their identity. So not under investigation, but charged by the police, someone who is representing their community, and we were threatened by that individual if we revealed their name. So clearly that doesn't make sense. Anyway, I know this isn't hugely relevant to the digital advertising industry, so I'll move on, but I just wanted to make that point. But look, our other main concern, there's lots we like about this report, but our other main concern is just, again, as Sarah touched on, the broad nature of the definitions. Like, there is no, from our reading at least, the government doesn't seem to distinguish between targeting someone, for example, because they are in Surrey Hills, which we think is fair and reasonable, to targeting someone that is visiting a fertility clinic, for one example, in Surrey Hills, which is a pretty serious invasion of someone's privacy in our view, and I think most people's view. So that's the big concern we've got. We think that's fixable, by the way. I think we can clean that up, but at the moment the report is just so broad that it makes that really difficult, and it does really threaten the digital advertising industry in particular, because pretty much every campaign has some form of targeting, right? So you're basically saying at the moment that you could potentially not run any advertising at all, digital advertising at all, which is obviously, I don't think that's the government's intention, but it just needs to be cleaned up.
Great. Fred, anything to add or a different take from a broadcaster point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo those sentiments that we are generally supportive of the changes. I think they're welcome, and we've been behind a number of other jurisdictions. I think because we've been so far behind, I think industry has largely got on with the job of putting in place measures to safeguard privacy. We ultimately have to be, we've got to be responsive to our user expectations. Community expectations are what they are. I think we have been impacted by the GDPR and other laws, and we've seen that through large tech giants imposing specific obligations, like Apple introducing its tracking notifications. So I think in response to that, we've seen privacy policies being probably more comprehensive than they were probably required to be. We've seen cookie notifications. We've seen a move away from third-party cookies. We've seen a move away from individualization to segmentation. We've seen the use of clean rooms to protect personal information, use of de-identified, aggregated, anonymized information. So the industry has moved on and put in place, I think, some quite good processes and policies that are aligned with community expectations. And I think, as we've seen from the statistics that you put out, there is a general acceptance amongst the community that there will be some form of targeted advertising. So it would be unfortunate to undo all that, or to create levels of uncertainty, which I think a lot of the changes introduce. I think broadening the definition of personal information creates ambiguity. I think that certainly the definitions around targeting and trading create enormous ambiguity. And I think you've got a really dangerous position where you've got an ambiguous law, you've got an underfunded, under-resourced regulator, and you've got a direct right of action in a country that has been the defamation capital of the world, that is highly litigious. And I think I'd be very concerned about opening the floodgates. I also think it potentially, an unintended consequence is it hands more power to businesses that hold more data. Certainly if targeting and trading were to be interpreted as preventing data enhancement, it will actually hand more power to businesses that hold more data about people, and also potentially encourage businesses to hold more data than they actually need to, which I think the number one concern I think people have is about security. And the best way to manage security is to minimize the amount of data you hold and use things like clean room procedures to enhance data. So I think there's definitely some positives in the legislation, and I think some of the practices that probably there were concerns about around trading as we would probably understand it, and around third-party cookies and tracking were probably, it's good that they've been addressed, but I think there's a real danger with the level of ambiguity that we could see a lot more basically floodgates with litigation.
Great, thanks. Brett, we've heard very much from the media owner side of things. I know you've played a number of roles in consulting and in business, but from your point of view, from an ad tech agency and a marketer point of view, and I know at the moment you work in a finance sort of role, which is a particularly, sensitive area.
Still want to sell stuff.
What do you read?
I think these reforms, if you're working for a company that has some exposure to GDPR, I don't think these reforms will surprise you at all. I think in many ways you'll just be thinking, okay, well, this just feels like business as usual. If you've been kept out of the dark and not had to touch or use GDPR, well, welcome to the rest of the world and up of reforming privacy law. But take heart. I remember 5 years ago, when GDPR was rolling in, everyone freaked out, didn't know what to do. There was an ambiguity. No one really figured out what we were meant to do. But we got through it. We figured it out. And regulations got clearer. Regulators were offered all sorts of guidance. So there's hope at the end of that tunnel. So I think that's good. From the targeting and profiling perspective, I agree there should be some clarity around this, because if there's not, it could really hurt some business models in the room. But I really don't believe the government's trying to stop you from creating segments. I really think the government's trying to put a proposal that says if you want to trade in those segments, you need consent. And I think it's the way the proposals are written, it's a separate type of consent to all the other consent that they've mentioned in the reform, because it's a very watered down version of consent. So that'll be interesting to see how that turns out in the final bill. But I don't think they're trying to stop you segmenting. And although I like the way the Californians have addressed that problem, which is we're going to segment, we're going to profile, we're going to target. If you don't want that, click the either do not sell my information or do not share the new do not share my personal information button. So more of a extract yourself from it regime, which I think is probably a little bit more straightforward and less onerous on business trying to figure out rules and processes around that. But the other thing I think is two things I think would be really useful, and I've grown to love this, is the controller processor distinction that GDPR offers and California offers now as well. It really helps you understand your role in the supply chain, and if you fall into the processor category under the current proposals, you'll sort of be a light touch compliance with a lot of these privacy reforms. So you can still be in the ecosystem, but you won't perhaps be as onerous in your compliance as someone who would be a controller who owns and decides how the personal information is used. But lastly, the other sleeping giant in all this was mentioned a few times through the reforms. In Australia is the ACCC. As much as they're going to reform privacy, as much as they've just announced a new privacy commissioner this morning, so that's great. No new funding though. I think just keep one eye on the ACCC, who are bringing prosecutions for misleading and deceptive, because you may, with all the will in the world, take these reforms, embrace them into your business, think you're doing a great job, but trip over on the fact that you might be misleading and deceiving consumers, and then the ACCC is going to come in and really, really give you a world of pain.
Okay, I'm going to shake things up. I'm not going to ask new questions. I'm going to turn things around a little bit. So from, I guess, both Sarah and Brett in particular have touched on overseas reform. Do you feel, and Brett, it sounds like from your discussion that you don't think it's putting us out of step with the rest of the world. I know there's a lot of people here who work in global industries or target overseas consumers. Do you feel this is creating unnecessary tension between Australia and the rest of the world? And I invite any of you to jump in there.
I'm net in favour of these reforms aligning us to the rest of the world, if only because, I mean, hands up in the room if you may not really deal with GDPR on a day-to-day, but you see these contracts that come in from Microsoft or Salesforce or Amazon, and they always have these European data processing agreements, and yeah, okay, I'm getting some nods and some laughs. So it's just going to align to that practice. It'll just make everything we're doing here make a bit more sense contextually, and probably be better for our customers and as well, consumers as well.
A alignment makes a lot of sense, but I mean, part of our concern is we're not convinced that that's what the reforms as proposed actually do yet. So there's a number of areas where they're just not quite in step. So that's, and bearing in mind as well, the reforms in, well, the GDPR, you know, is consistently sort of, is changing, and there's you know, things happening, investigations and decisions, and the recently introduced legislation in the UK, which is actually updating what the GDPR is and how it's interpreted. So it's a moving feast, and what's proposed at the moment in Australia on our reading is just is stricter in some areas, some important areas for our industry compared to other places. So
I'd agree with that, and specifically when you're dealing with the globals, it makes sense to have similar language in the legislation. If they're talking about legitimate interest, we should be talking about it too. So this is a level of consistency. But we also need to be mindful about comparing ourselves to other jurisdictions. The EU, Ireland is the only country in the EU that's a common law system. Every other system is civil law. And civil law systems tend to be a lot less litigious, a lot less expensive litigation. But even still, I've heard that there's 60 odd cases for the before the European Highest Court seeking clarifications around the GDPR. So I think we're in a jurisdiction that is highly litigious, and I think the other thing to note is there's certain, when it comes to journalist exemption, for example, every European country is signed up to the European Convention of Human Rights that recognises free speech. So there is a long history of balancing interests, and we also have the benefit of hindsight. So one advantage to going this late is that we've seen what's worked in other jurisdictions and what hasn't. For example, the right to be forgotten was introduced in the EU. That all seemed like an innocent enough thing to happen. I mean, the BBC keeps a blog of the types of articles that have been subject to right to be forgotten requests, and they include articles about murderers and rapists. Like that was never probably the intention when somebody wanted to have it forgotten that he was bankrupt 20 years ago, but that was the unintended consequences. We've also seen consent fatigue in the EU with pop-ups on websites for cookies and things like that. So I think we have the benefit of hindsight. We should use that when making these reforms now.
So talking about, I guess, us being a bit later and that benefit of hindsight, and again, I'm going to throw a question that was at the end up earlier because I think it's a really important thing to frame. I guess two questions. So one is, do we feel these reforms, if they get to a more, some of the wrinkles are ironed out, particularly in terms of targeting, do we feel like this is I know nothing's evergreen, but suitable for purpose for the next 10, 12 years? And off the back of that, and I might get Sarah to answer that in terms of timing on all of this, particularly for people in the audience when they can expect to actually have to do something.
Yeah, on the wrinkles, there's quite a few to iron out, so I'm no comment there yet. On the timing, we haven't really got any indication at the moment. So the submissions aren't even up on the AGD website yet. I think they're really, they've probably received a lot, and there's a lot in the report. There's probably a lot in the submissions received. They're going through those. I think, I don't think they may have turned their minds to it, but there's no indication if we're going to see legislation this year or not. Some have suggested that the timeframes might be a bit delayed, but that's unclear. It's we don't really know. So,
although it is worth making the point that this is the same department that is also responsible for carrying out the voice. So I can't see this getting ahead of that process somehow. I think we've got a bit of time.
Yeah, good.
Well, there's still some more consultation to come out of the report anyway, so that's at least this year, maybe into next, before we probably start to see a draft bill alongside that. So I wouldn't be, I don't know what to say in terms of rushing out the doors now and ringing your lawyers, but I think if I was going to encourage you to
got
do anything,
business cards?
I think I was going to encourage you to do anything. One would be just to make sure you increase your literacy in this topic, first of all, because there'll come a point where the legislation will come in some form and you'll need to work out what it means for your business. And the better you are prepared to have those conversations with your legal team, because, and I'll say, if there is the tension in the conversation, that's probably good. If there's no tension in those conversations, someone's not doing their job right. But you've got to work through it, right? You've got to find a solution to how your business needs to keep operating in light of whatever the regime may look like in the future. So I'd just be starting to think about, using these as themes. How might you need to think about your business going forward? Starting those conversations now, so perhaps there's no sticker shock when these things do drop.
Yeah. Dan, as the other non-lawyer on the stage, I don't know, I think you've got your head around the whole privacy thing a lot more than me, but I'd love you to try and explain to the audience fair and reasonable versus legitimate interest. Because it seems to get to a very enjoyable lawyer philosophical space with the rest of us going, what am I meant to do?
Are you and I the only two people that aren't lawyers on this stage? Is that...
I try to hide the fact, but yeah.
Okay, fantastic. All right, this is going to be very pedestrian to the three of you, but hopefully might make some sense to people out there. We'll see. Look, the fair and reasonable test, I should say from the outset, that's something that, a concept that The Guardian has actually proposed, or a version of has proposed for, in all of our submissions, there's been about 13 or something by now, I think, over the last few years. And effectively what that states is that if your data collection and use is fair and reasonable, you don't need to burden the consumer by asking for consent. So we like this because it's an opportunity to simplify the privacy regime and actually learn, as we touched on earlier, learn from some of the mistakes I think that have been made, particularly with GDPR in the UK, where the internet has become littered with these consent banners that pop up all over the internet for fair and reasonable collection of consumer data. As a consequence, it is basically, as a non-lawyer, but someone who cares about this space, I can say it is basically impossible to summarise the complexities of a privacy policy in a few sentences on a consent banner. No one reads them, obviously. Most people just hit consent to get on with their day. It doesn't work, right? So a fair and reasonable, if your data collection is fair and reasonable, you shouldn't have to burden the consumer by asking for consent. What is fair and reasonable is I guess, the big question, but we'll come to that in a second. We would also go further, though. We would say that if you want to make this work properly, you need to combine this with express purpose limitations, which is a concept I've been banging on about to some of you for probably too long. But effectively what that means is some data collection should simply not be permitted no matter what, even with consumer consent. So therefore, what that would, and I'll come to what that will be in a second with an example, but what that would do then is it would mean that you're only really asking for consent if you're collecting sensitive data or if you're doing something which is quite unusual with consumer data. And in that case, hopefully, it will happen far less frequently. Consumers will actually start to pay attention when they get these consent banners pop up and actually start to take it a bit more seriously than they do now. So it would give us an opportunity to simplify the whole thing. So to bring this to life, the best example I can give is probably sort of expanding on what I said earlier. So we think, for example, it is completely fair and reasonable to target a consumer based on their state or postcode that they are in. The potential for harm in that circumstance is pretty small. It's largely how offline advertising works with a lot of the offline mediums as well. We think that's fair and reasonable. You don't need to ask the consumer for consent, nor does the consumer need to have the right to opt out of that, in our view. That seems fair and reasonable. However, let's say that The Guardian developed a mobile operating system, for example, and was widely adopted around the world. Then in that circumstance, you would be able to, with great respect to my friends in the tech companies in the room, you would then be able to target consumers potentially, or track consumers down to their individual location throughout their day. Now, that is actually surveillance. That's where the term surveillance capitalism actually makes sense. It doesn't most of the time. It's thrown around, I think, in a really unhelpful way most of the time. But tracking someone where they're going at any moment of the day is surveillance, and using that for selling targeted advertising. And the benefit of outlawing this for collection of consumer data for the purposes of selling targeted advertising is it's not only privacy enhancing for the consumer, but it is also competition enhancing, because it will go some way to limiting the data arms race which is currently underway. And then you'll have an opportunity when lots of the smaller companies that are in this room, publishers, the kind of operators that have limited first-party data compared to the large tech companies which have privacy policies which run across multiple products and reach almost every Australian, it would give us a better opportunity to compete. Normally, privacy and competition are traded off against each other. If with fair and reasonable combined with purpose limitations, you not only enhance consumer privacy, you also enhance competition, and therefore we think it's a really good thing.
Yeah.
How'd that go?
Yeah. I guess it's a tricky thing. I'm going to put the consumer hat on because it feels like a safer place to be at the moment. I guess that's a tricky concept to get across to consumers. So theoretically, economically, that makes sense, but that differentiation between different players is a tricky thing to do. I'm going to make you change roles. This is where I think I'm going to go now. So one last question for each of you, and then we're going to go to the audience. If you had one piece of advice or one area for the type of company I'm about to give you to focus on while we're in this, year or so of influencing government, updating whatever we need to do internally, what would your advice be? Dan, if you're a marketer, what would you be doing now, or what would you be the highest amount of concern in terms of reform?
Look, it probably is what we've already touched on, what Brett mentioned before. I just think this industry is going to be impacted one way or another, right? So you just have to come up to speed on this, and you have to immediately start to think in simple terms. How am I using consumer data? Is it fair and reasonable? And for the practices that aren't fair and reasonable, you probably need to start preparing to get out of those things pretty quickly. It's difficult, right? Because the report is so broad and the definitions are so broad that it's hard to know exactly where the government is going to draw the line. But I think that, I hope at least, that there's going to be some sensible discussion over the next 12 months, and therefore we'll get to a place where it's a bit clearer. But I think Australia has largely had carte blanche to do whatever we want with consumer data for the last few years. That's changing, obviously, really quickly. So I would be getting ahead of this pretty quickly. I can say from experience, I joined The Guardian just after GDPR came in many years ago. And because we weren't prepared for it, we ended up just throwing away a huge amount of consumer data and having to start again just because we were behind the 8 ball. So you're better off, I think, getting ahead of this, figuring out what consumer data that you have collected in a fair and reasonable way is useful, and starting to prepare to get out of the stuff that isn't. Because if you don't do that, you run the risk of doing what we had to do, which is effectively throw out a lot of consumer data, more consumer data than we needed to, and start again. So that would be probably the one bit of advice I would offer.
Cool. Fred, I'll go to you next. If you're an ad tech company, what would your advice be? What would you be thinking about? What would you be doing?
Oh, tricky one. I think working with clients in a way that minimises. I think to touch on what Dan said, maximising the efficiency of the sorts of data sets that you're dealing with. For example, postcodes, gender, age brackets, that sort of generalised segmented information that is probably, hopefully, once the reforms come through, is going to be something that is going to be something that it continues to be permitted to be used. But certainly moving away from any kind of, to the extent that you haven't already, moving away from that individualisation and one-on-one sort of targeting, which I think we can all probably say is likely to be prohibited. So yeah. I think that would probably be the focus.
Cool. Brett, you run a loyalty program. Any differences there for that type of business?
I'd be comforted that most loyalty programs are probably geared to cope with this kind of change. Their tech stacks are probably more nimble to change and updating things, so I'd take some comfort there. But I'd be concerned about the targeting proposals and what that actually meant, so I'd be focused with a whole team of people wondering, sort of gaming worst case interpretation, best case interpretation, and just trying to see where we might need to pull out of some certain activities, or where we might need to go to consumers and talk to them and be a bit more transparent. And if it was a consent, collect that, or if it was notice, give that notice, to make sure we could continue operating the program. Because loyalty programs, most people want the stuff that are being offered, and most loyalty programs offer some free flights. And I know, try booking one; it's really hard with reward points. You got a new CEO, go call Vanessa. But I'd be confident that they'd probably weather the storm a lot better and a lot easier than some of the other companies. But I'd be focused on how I'd need to manipulate my business model to make sure I could keep working.
All right. Sarah, last one for you. IAB members in the room, how should they be engaging with us?
Well, we will keep people up to date on where everything's up to. I think at the moment, the key focus really is to make sure that it is the best case scenario, not the worst case scenario when we see some legislation. So at the moment, I do think there's a role for industry to really make sure that we talk to government and put forward, the practical scenarios and explain what the problems look like if we end up getting the worst case scenario. That's not where we want to be. We don't think it's the intention, but we really need to get clarity on that.
Cool. All right, I'm going to open it to the floor, and JJ, going to tell me if there's any Slido questions.
I'm just in a panic, dialing into it.
Oh, that surprises me. Oh, do you want to grab one?
Sorry, Dan. Taught?
Who wants to go?
Frederick's a litigator.
I should probably do it. Interesting. Tort is an interesting one because it's if you have a contract. There's two types of basic litigation. You have a contract dispute where you have a contractual relationship with someone and you can end falling out with each other. Tort is you don't have you might not even have a direct relationship with them, and that is where, particularly around the journalist exemption, is particularly problematic because it's actually the Privacy Act is not designed to regulate the sort of activities that journalists do, because the Privacy Act is primarily concerned with transactional relationships between an organisation, a business or a health provider, or whatever, and the person who's sharing the information. Whereas journalists are doing the opposite. They're actually accessing information often without the person's knowledge to then reveal something. So, and the tort gives people the ability to go after this other party. A key part of tort, though, is damage, and this is one thing that is never really been substantiated in this area. We talk about privacy harms, and I think that's something that a starting point for legislation should be: what is the specific harm that you're seeking to deal with, and is this a proportionate response to that perceived harm? So I think it would be interesting to see if we do see cases, what sort of damages figures you'd be looking at, because it could be difficult to value.
Can I just add, just in case it's not obvious, so at the moment, the way it works is if someone has a complaint or thinks that their privacy has been invaded, they have to make a complaint to the Information Commissioner, and the Information Commissioner then effectively investigates that. The problem is the Information Commissioner is woefully underfunded, so it doesn't get a chance to do a lot of the work that it needs to do, and we think that needs to change. But keeping them as the umpire, if you like, to determine what is a data breach and what actually deserves to be investigated is a sensible thing to do to prevent some of the spurious kind of things that we've seen in the UK and that we touched on, that where people are basically trying to get in the way of journalists doing their job by threatening to sue, which is what we've seen overseas. I'm not sure if that helps.
Okay, back on advertising. Sorry. Back on advertising.
Well, Gay, I should probably just mention as well that, there's a difference of views amongst IAB members around the statutory tort. So, that's, we've heard very much the media position here today, but there are other views as well, just noting that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, there is a related question, actually, in terms of, are the ramifications or penalties harsh enough? In
Australia, the penalties have just gone up to meet GDPR standards of 10% of turnover and 50 million, for data breaches. So I imagine those will probably find their way into the new reforms at some level.
Well, they, prior to sort of December last year, I think they were 2.2 million per data breach, and now they're 55.5 or the greater of either 55.5 million per breach or 3 times annual turnover or 3 times the benefit, something like that. So they're huge.
And even larger, the ACCC penalties for misleading and deceptive conduct are huge.
But I think it's also important to point out, though, that in the GDPR, in the EU, there haven't been huge fines handed out for data breaches. Most of the fines were handed out for things like breaches of cookies policies and things like that. And actually, it would be interesting, large fines for data breaches, they potentially undermine the whole the narrative around the data breach has been slightly strange, because businesses that have been the victim of criminal hacks have been portrayed as being the baddies. And I mean, if a bank was robbed, you wouldn't blame the bank for being robbed. Businesses are facing cybersecurity risks every single day, and no business wants to be hacked. The reputational damage is significant. And I think what needs to happen is, in a situation where there's a hack, there needs to be maximum transparency, maximum cooperation, and incentivize for businesses to actually go to the regulators, go to individuals as soon as possible to deal with it. So I would be surprised if we actually see the fines being applied to, unless there's been gross negligence on the part of a business, just for data breaches. I think we're more likely to see it for things like trading and targeting when we shouldn't be.
Another reason to really try and get the definition straight.
Although, just thinking what Frederick just said then, you probably won't get fined because you had a hack, but you probably will get fined before a hack if you're keeping data you shouldn't have in the first place, which is the Commissioner's focus this year. And that's the only way to mitigate that breach risk, really.
There is one more, if we have time, on fair and reasonable in terms of, is there an issue with regards to, say, large holding companies that own more than one asset or domain? And is it fair and reasonable if you're collecting, you're consenting to data being collected in one, and yet that's therefore consensual for another, where it may be a completely different consumer experience?
I think it's really hard to comment. Like the key point really is we don't know what they're going to be considering as fair and reasonable, and so the requirement applies to any collection, use or disclosure of data. So you'd have to look at the specific, exactly what's going on there and decide. But we really need to get more clarity on exactly how it's going to be applied.
All right. Thank you, panellists.